there is a sound that comes before the Wendigo, not the crunch of snow underfoot, not the crack of ice on the lake. Something older than either, a wind that moves through the pines without touching them, a cold that reaches past your coat, past your skin, and settles in the hollow of your chest where hunger lives. The Algonquin peoples of the northern forests knew this sound. They had a word for it, carried in the breath of winter, spoken only when necessary: Wendigo. The name itself is cautionary. To speak, it is to acknowledge something that should not be named. To name it is to give it shape in the world where shapes should not be. Imagine a cabin, logs chinked with moss and mud. A single window that looks out onto nothing but white. Inside, the fire has burned low. Outside, the temperature has fallen to 40 below. The nearest settlement is 3 days' journey on snowshoes, and the snow is still falling. The provisions ran out 2 weeks ago. This is where the story begins. Not in the cabin itself, but in the space between one breath and the next. In the moment when hunger stops being a sensation and becomes a presence, a thing that sits across from you, a thing that waits. The branches crack in the wind, or they sound like bones breaking. It is difficult to tell the difference when you have not eaten in 14 days. The indigenous peoples of the subarctic understood something that we have forgotten in our age of abundance. Hunger is not merely the absence of food. It is a force, an entity, something that can grow until it devours not just the body, but the soul itself. They knew that in the deep winter, when the caribou have migrated and the fish are locked beneath ice 3 feet thick, a person could be consumed by something worse than starvation. They could be consumed by need. The Wendigo is the name they gave to this transformation. The moment when a human being crosses the threshold and becomes something else. Something that hungers without end. Something that in consuming others can never be satisfied, because the more it eats, the more it grows. And the more it grows, the more it must eat. This is not a story about a monster in the woods. This is a story about what happens when hunger forgets how to stop. In the beginning, there was balance. The Ojibwe knew it. The Cree knew it. The Innu and the Naskapi and all the peoples who made their lives in the vast boreal forests that stretch from the Great Lakes to Hudson Bay, from Quebec to the Rockies. They understood that winter was not merely a season but a covenant, a test. The land gave what it could, and in return, you took only what you needed. No more. To take more was to invite catastrophe. But to take from your own kind, that was to step outside the circle of creation itself. The Wendigo emerged from this understanding. It was not, in its oldest form, simply a creature of legend told to frighten children. It was the personification of a spiritual law, that cannibalism was not merely a crime against others, but a crime against the self. To consume human flesh was to become insatiable, to open a door that could never be closed. In Ojibwe tradition, the Wendigo is described as gaunt, despite its constant feeding. Its body is skeletal, its skin stretched thin over bone and sinew. Its eyes are pushed deep into their sockets. Its lips are tattered and bloody from gnawing. Some accounts say it stands as tall as a tree. others that it grows with each victim it consumes, so that its hunger becomes both literally and figuratively larger than any satisfaction could possibly fill. The creature's heart, they say, is made of ice. This detail is not incidental. In the cosmology of the northern peoples, ice is not merely frozen water. It is the absence of warmth, of community, of the fire that keeps both body and spirit alive. To have a heart of ice is to be fundamentally disconnected from humanity. It is to exist in a state of perpetual winter, even in summer, to hunger in a way that can never be warmed. The Cree spoke of the Wichtiko, a cannibal giant whose mere presence could bring blizzards. The Innu described the Achin, a creature whose screams in the night warned of famine to come, different names for the same essential truth, that there are hungers beyond the physical. That greed unchecked becomes a kind of possession, that the act of consuming another person transforms the eater into something no longer quite human. But here is what is crucial to understand. The Wendigo was not evil in the way we think of evil in the modern West. It was not a demon that chose wickedness. It was a warning, a consequence, a map of what happened when the delicate balance between need and community collapsed. In some traditions, a person became a Wendigo through the act of cannibalism itself. The first bite was the transformation. In others, the Wendigo spirit possessed someone who was already starving, already desperate, whispering that there was another way to survive, that the unthinkable could become thinkable, that one person's death could mean another's life. And in the terrible mathematics of winter, this was sometimes true. But the cost, the stories said, was everything. There are accounts, oral histories passed down through generations, of individuals who survived winters so harsh they defied comprehension. Winters when the snow came in October and did not leave until May, when the temperatures dropped so low that spit froze before it hit the ground, when hunting parties went out and never returned, swallowed by white nothing. In such winters, choices were made, terrible choices. And the Wendigo stories served as both explanation and deterrent. They said, yes, you might survive by breaking the ultimate taboo, but you will not survive as yourself. The thing that continues will wear your face, but it will not be you. This was the indigenous understanding, that the greatest danger was not death, but transformation. Not starvation, but the hunger that outlives starvation. Not the body's need, but the moment when need becomes the only truth. The Wendigo, then, was not a monster to be slain. It was a mirror held up to the worst possibilities of the human heart. It asked, what would you do to survive? And more importantly, what would you become? The forests whispered the answer in the wind. You would become hunger itself. To understand the Wendigo, you must first understand winter, not the winter of snow days and hot chocolate, not the winter of sweaters and fireplaces and brief walks in picturesque cold. The winter of the subarctic, the winter that kills. In the boreal forests that ring the top of the world, winter is not a season but a siege. It arrives suddenly, often in October, and does not release its grip until May. Temperatures routinely plunge to 30 40, 50 degrees below zero. The sun, when it appears at all, traces a low arc across the southern horizon for a few pale hours before darkness returns. The snow falls not in inches but in feet, meters, drifts that can swallow a person whole. In such a place, survival is not a matter of convenience or comfort. It is a matter of mathematics. The human body requires roughly 2,000 calories a day to maintain basic function. In extreme cold, that number can double, even triple. Your metabolism becomes a furnace, burning everything it can find just to keep your core temperature above the point where cells begin to die. Fat, muscle. Eventually, if there is nothing else, the body begins to consume itself. This is the landscape in which the Wendigo was born. For the Algonquin peoples, winter survival was a communal act. Families and bands moved together, following game, sharing kills, maintaining stores of dried meat and fish, and wild rice gathered in the autumn plenty. But the movements of game were never certain. Caribou migrations could shift. Moose populations could collapse. Fish runs could fail, and then the stores would begin to dwindle. There were protocols for this, sacred practices. When food grew scarce, it was divided equally. The hunters went out again and again, pushing farther into the cold, sleeping in snow shelters, returning sometimes with something, sometimes with nothing. The elders ate less so the children could eat more. Everyone understood. You survived together, or you died together. To hoard was unthinkable. To steal from the common store was to steal life itself. And to consume the flesh of your own kind, that was to step outside the circle of reciprocity that held the community together. It was to declare that your survival mattered more than the survival of all. It was to become, fundamentally, alone. The Wendigo represented this aloneness, this separation from the human community and the moral universe that sustained it. Those who became Wendigos, whether through cannibalism, possession, or the slow erosion of humanity through extreme privation, were described as existing in a state of perpetual isolation. They wandered the forests alone. They could not share food because they could not stop eating. They could not enter a dwelling because they brought winter with them. They were appetite without relationship, hunger without hope of satisfaction. The oral traditions are filled with stories of Wendigos, calling out in human voices from the darkness beyond the fire, using the voices of loved ones, of the lost, of those who had gone out into the snow and not returned. They called for help, for warmth, for just one night by the fire, and the law was absolute. You did not answer, because compassion itself could be a trap. The Wendigo could not be saved. It could only be destroyed, usually by a shaman or warrior brave enough to face it, to stab it with iron, burn its heart, scatter the ashes to the four directions. This was not cruelty, it was mercy. Because to be a Wendigo was to exist in a state of suffering without end, to be tortured by a hunger that grew with every feeding. Better to release the spirit, better to end the cycle. But here is what haunts the stories. The people who became Wendigos were not strangers. They were husbands, wives, children, members of the community who had, through circumstance or desperation or some dark turning of the soul, crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The stories do not judge them harshly. There is sorrow in the telling. Recognition that the line between survival and monstrosity is thinner than anyone wants to believe. That winter, in its extremity, revealed capacities in the human heart that were better left unrevealed. The Wendigo, then, was not just a monster. It was a tragedy. A person who had become a hunger so vast that personhood itself was consumed by it. And the story said, this could be you. This could be anyone. All it takes is one winter too many, one desperate moment, one choice made when the fire is dying and the last food is gone, and the sound of your children crying has become unbearable. The Wendigo is what happens when survival becomes the only law. When the taboos that hold civilization together, the rules against murder, against cannibalism, against placing the self above the community, crumble before the simple, terrible arithmetic of starvation. In the old stories, the elders would say, the Wendigo is not out there in the forest. The Wendigo is in here, in the heart, in the belly, in the part of us that, when pushed far enough, would do anything to survive. The wind knows this, the winter knows this, and the forests, in their ancient silence, remember. The Europeans arrived in the northern territories with their own hungers. They came for furs, for land, for souls to save and resources to extract. They came with guns and steel traps and Bibles bound in leather. They came with the certainty that they were bringing civilization to a wilderness, light to darkness, order to chaos. They did not understand that they were entering a world with its own orders, its own lights, its own gods. The first written accounts of the Wendigo appear in the Jesuit Relations, detailed reports sent back to France by missionaries working among the Algonquin peoples in the 17th century. These were men of learning and faith, trained in theology and natural philosophy. They believed in demons, in possession, in the literal reality of evil walking the earth. When they heard the stories of the Wendigo, they understood them immediately, and completely wrong. Father Paul Lejeune, writing in 1636, describes encountering an Innu man who claimed to have been visited by a creature in the night. The man was terrified. He said the thing had whispered to him, had promised him meat if he would only come into the forest, had offered him relief from hunger. The man refused to leave his dwelling for 3 days. Lejeune interpreted this as demonic temptation. He wrote, "These people are much vexed by the devil. He appears to them in the form of various beasts, and sometimes as a man, and speaks to them. Many of them are so frightened that they dare not remain alone." What the priest did not understand, could not understand, given his framework, was that the Wendigo was not the Christian devil. It was not external evil seeking to corrupt innocence. It was a manifestation of internal transformation. A warning about what happened when human beings were pushed beyond the limits of human morality. The distinction mattered, but in the colonial records, it was lost. By the 18th century, as fur traders pushed deeper into the northern territories, Wendigo stories began to appear in explorers' journals and company records. These accounts are fascinating and troubling in equal measure. The Europeans were drawn to the stories. They fit neatly into their own folklore of werewolves and ghouls, but they flattened them, stripped them of context, turned them from moral philosophy into monster tale. A Hudson's Bay Company trader named John Tanner, who lived among the Ojibwe in the early 1800s, recorded one of the most detailed accounts of a Wendigo encounter. In the winter of 1808, near Lake Winnipeg, a hunter named Abishabas began to act strangely. He stopped sharing his kills. He ate alone, ravenously, even when others were starving. His eyes, Tanner wrote, had taken on a strange and hungry appearance. The community elders recognized what was happening. They said Abishabas had been touched by the Wendigo spirit, that he was transforming. They tried to cure him, with prayers, with smoke, with ceremonies meant to drive out the possessing hunger. But it did not work. Abishabas killed his wife, then his brother, then he fled into the forest. A party of warriors tracked him through the snow for 3 days. When they found him, he was crouched over the partial remains of his brother, still eating. He did not recognize them, did not seem to see them as human at all, only as more meat. They killed him there, burned the body, scattered the ashes. Tanner records this matter-of-factly, but with a kind of suppressed horror. He did not believe in the Wendigo as a real creature. He was too much a man of his age for that. But he could not explain what he had witnessed, could not reconcile the man Abishabas had been with the thing he became. The account troubled Tanner for the rest of his life. Such stories circulated in the trading posts and mission stations, gaining embellishment with each retelling. The Wendigo became, in the European imagination, a boogeyman, a savage myth, evidence of the natives' superstition and credulity. What was lost in this translation was the sophistication of the original belief system. The Wendigo was not a campfire story. It was a psychological and moral framework for understanding extreme behavior under extreme conditions. It acknowledged that humans were capable of monstrous acts and provided a vocabulary for those acts, a way to name the unnameable, to process the trauma of survival cannibalism without destroying the social fabric of the community. By dismissing it as mere superstition, the colonial witnesses missed the profound truth at its core: that civilization is a fragile thing, that the taboos against murder and cannibalism are not absolute moral laws, but survival strategies, and that under the right conditions, or the wrong ones, anyone could cross that line. The Europeans would learn this truth themselves. In the Arctic expeditions of the 19th century, when British sailors ate their comrades in the ice. In the wagon trains trapped in mountain passes. In every desperate winter when food ran out and choices narrowed to the unthinkable. But when Europeans committed such acts, they called it tragedy, necessity, a moral crisis requiring theological reflection. When indigenous peoples warned about it, they called it superstition. The wind did not care about the distinction. Neither did winter. Neither did the hunger that waited in the cold, patient and ancient, knowing that humans of every color and creed tasted exactly the same. In 1879, a Cree man named Swift Runner walked out of the northern Alberta wilderness alone. He should not have been alone. He had gone into the bush with his wife, his mother, his brother, and his 6 children. They had planned to spend the winter trapping in a hunting camp far from the nearest settlement. When spring finally came and the ice broke on the rivers, Swift Runner returned to the trading post at Fort Saskatchewan. He was well fed, almost plump. His family was not with him. The story he told was that they had starved, that the winter had been too harsh, the game too scarce, that one by one they had succumbed to hunger and cold. He alone had survived. But the other Cree at the fort knew something was wrong. They saw how Swift Runner's eyes moved, how he could not meet their gaze, how he kept licking his lips. They spoke to the Northwest Mounted Police, and an investigation was launched. What they found, when they traveled to the winter camp, defied belief. The remains were scattered, dismembered, boiled. The bones split for marrow, skulls crushed, evidence of systematic butchering, and provisions, stores of dried meat and fish and flour that had never been touched. The family had not starved. They had been murdered and consumed. Swift Runner confessed, but his confession was strange. He spoke of being possessed, of a presence that had entered him in the deep winter, a hunger that was not his own. He said he had tried to fight it, but the voice inside him was too strong. It told him to eat. It told him that his family's flesh would make him powerful, that he would never be hungry again. He had, he said, become Wendigo. The Canadian authorities did not know what to make of this. They were not anthropologists. They did not understand the cultural framework Swift Runner was invoking. To them, he was simply a murderer, a cannibal, a monster. They hanged him in December of 1879. But the case troubled those who heard of it. Because Swift Runner was not insane in the clinical sense. He was lucid, coherent. He understood that what he had done was wrong, but he also insisted, with a kind of terrible sincerity, that he had not been in control, that something else had taken hold of him, the Wendigo. This was not an isolated case. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, similar incidents occurred across the subarctic regions of Canada. The anthropological literature of the period refers to them collectively as cases of Wendigo psychosis, a culture-bound syndrome in which individuals became convinced they were transforming into Wendigos, that they were possessed by insatiable hunger, that they would inevitably consume those around them. The psychiatrist and anthropologist Morton Tieker documented over 70 cases in his research. Many followed a pattern: isolation, extreme stress, the onset of a paranoid conviction that one was becoming a cannibal monster. Often, the afflicted person would beg to be killed before they could harm others. Sometimes, this request was granted. In one case from 1896, a man named Jack Fiddler, a Cree shaman, killed over 14 people he believed had been possessed by the Wendigo spirit. He did this openly, with the support of his community, because they too believed the transformations were real. That these individuals were no longer people but things, monsters that would consume the community if allowed to live. When Canadian authorities finally arrested Fiddler in 1907, the case created a media sensation. Here was a man who admitted to serial killing, but claimed he was performing a sacred duty, protecting his people from a spiritual threat. The trial was a clash of worldviews so fundamental that no translation between them seemed possible. Fiddler was convicted of murder. He hanged himself in prison before the sentence could be carried out. Western psychiatry has struggled to categorize these cases. Is Wendigo psychosis a real disorder? A culture-bound expression of universal human anxieties about scarcity and violence? Or something else entirely? A framework that allowed indigenous communities to process and respond to the genuine threat of survival cannibalism. The clinical literature is inconclusive. Some psychiatrists argue it was a form of delusional disorder. Others suggest it was a culturally sanctioned expression of suicidal or homicidal ideation. Still, others point out that many of the documented cases occurred during periods of extreme colonial stress, when traditional ways of life were collapsing, when forced relocations and residential schools were tearing apart families, when the old protocols for surviving winter were no longer functional. Perhaps the Wendigo psychosis was not madness at all, but a rational response to an irrational situation. A way for individuals to name the horror they were experiencing, to say, "I am losing my humanity. I am becoming something I do not recognize. Please stop me before I destroy everything I love." The stories from this period are almost unbearable to read. They speak of good men and women, loving parents, skilled hunters, respected elders, who became convinced they were monsters, who saw their own hands as claws, who looked at their children and felt only hunger. What drives a person to such a state? Is it purely psychological? Or is there something more, some deep recognition of capacity, some awareness of the predator that sleeps inside the human skin, waiting for conditions dire enough to wake it? The anthropological archives offer no easy answers. Only case after case of people who believed with absolute conviction that they were transforming, that the Wendigo was real, that it was happening to them. And who can say, with absolute certainty, that they were wrong? Not about the literal existence of a supernatural creature, but about the transformation itself, about the way extreme hunger and isolation and desperation can unmake a person, can turn love into appetite, can make the unthinkable seem not only possible, but necessary. The Wendigo in this reading is not a delusion. It is a description, a phenomenological account of what it feels like when humanity breaks, when the self fragments under the pressure of need too great to be borne. The cases stop appearing in the literature around the 1960s, not because the phenomenon ended, but because the world changed. Airlifts and radio communications and government assistance reached even the remotest northern communities. The conditions that created Wendigo psychosis, absolute isolation, prolonged starvation, the breakdown of communal survival strategies, became rarer. But the hunger did not disappear. It simply found new forms. The Wendigo, the old people said, grows larger with each feeding. By the 20th century, it had grown very large indeed. Consider the fur trade. At its peak, in the late 1700s and early 1800s, millions of beaver pelts were stripped from the northern forests each year. Entire watersheds were trapped out. The beaver, a keystone species whose dams create wetlands that support countless other forms of life, was hunted to near extinction across vast regions. The trade enriched European companies beyond measure. The Hudson's Bay Company, the Northwest Company. They accumulated wealth that would eventually shape the economic landscape of nations. They opened new territories, built commercial empires, and they called it progress. But from the perspective of the northern forests, from the perspective of the indigenous peoples whose lives were bound to those forests, it looked like something else. It looked like a hunger that could never be satisfied, a need that grew larger the more it was fed, that destroyed the source of its own sustenance in order to consume more. It looked like Wendigo. The parallel is not metaphorical. It is exact. The Wendigo in mythology was characterized by one defining trait. Its hunger increased in proportion to what it ate. The more it consumed, the larger it grew. The larger it grew, the more it needed to consume. There was no equilibrium, no satisfaction, only appetite spiraling into itself. This is the logic of exploitation, of colonial extraction, of capitalism in its most rapacious form. Take more than the system can regenerate. Use the profit to expand the capacity to take more. Repeat until collapse. The only difference between a Wendigo and a corporation is that the corporation has a board of directors. The indigenous peoples of the North understood this, not in economic terms, those would come later, but in spiritual ones. They watched the fur traders arrive with their promises of wealth and their insatiable appetite for pelts. They watched the forests empty, the game disappear, the old balance shatter. And they said, "This is Wendigo. Not a creature in the woods, a hunger in the system, a possession that turned humans into instruments of consumption." That valued growth over sustainability, profit over relationship, the next quarter over the next 7 generations. By the late 20th century, as indigenous scholars and activists began to reclaim and reinterpret their own traditions, the Wendigo emerged as a powerful symbol of critique. Writers like Basil Johnston and Winona LaDuke pointed out that the Wendigo myth was not about individual cannibalism. It was about societal cannibalism, about systems that consumed people and land and future in order to feed an appetite that could never be satisfied. The Wendigo, they said, was the perfect metaphor for modernity. Consider, we live in an age of unprecedented abundance, and yet the hunger only grows. We produce enough food to feed the world twice over, and yet millions starve while others struggle with diseases of overconsumption. We accumulate wealth beyond the wildest dreams of any previous age, and yet it is never enough. Always more, always growth, always the next acquisition, the next market, the next resource to extract. The Wendigo's heart was made of ice. Ours are made of stock portfolios and profit margins. The effect is the same. We are, as a civilization, possessed. Not by a literal monster, but by an ideology that demands endless consumption on a finite planet. That treats nature as resource and human beings, as labor and everything, as potential fuel for the machine of economic growth. And like the Wendigo, we grow larger with each feeding. Our cities sprawl. Our appetites expand. Our sense of what is necessary inflates to match whatever we can produce. a standard of living that would have seemed like unimaginable luxury to our grandparents, now feels like the bare minimum. This is not critique of individuals. It is observation of a system. We are all caught in it, all possessed to some degree by hungers we did not create but cannot escape. The hunger for security, for status, for the next thing that promises to fill the hollow place inside us. The hollow place that only grows larger the more we try to fill it. The environmental movement has recognized this. The language of sustainable growth and carbon footprints is an attempt to constrain the Wendigo, to put limits on consumption, to say this far and no farther. But the hunger resists limits. It always has. It whispers that limits are arbitrary, that growth is natural, that there will always be more forest to clear, more oil to extract, more markets to exploit. That we can eat our way to satisfaction. The Wendigo whispered the same thing. And the lesson of every Wendigo story is the same. The hunger lies. There is no satisfaction. There is only the moment when the last resource is consumed, the last forest is cut, the last fish is caught, and the thing that remains looks around at the wasteland it has created and realizes, too late, that it has devoured its own future. The Algonquin peoples saw this coming, not in the specific details. They could not have predicted climate change or mass extinction or microplastics in the bloodstream of every living thing. But they understood the principle. They encoded it in their most terrifying myth. They said, "There is a hunger that grows without limit, that destroys everything it touches, that cannot be reasoned with or satisfied. That must be stopped before it consumes the world." We called it superstition. They called it prophecy. The wind in the forests knows which was correct. The Wendigo has never been more popular than it is now. It appears in horror novels and films and video games. In Algernon, Blackwood's 1910 tale, The Wendigo, it is a force of primal terror in the Canadian wilderness. In Stephen King's Pet Sematary, it lurks at the edges of the narrative, an unnamed presence in the woods behind the cemetery. In the television series Hannibal, it becomes a fever dream, a manifestation of the cannibal psychiatrist's inner world, rendered in grotesque visual metaphor. The creature has been reimagined 1,000 ways. Sometimes it is a zombie-like monster, fast and ravenous. Sometimes it is skeletal and impossibly tall, with antlers and eyes that glow in the dark. Sometimes it is barely visible, just a sense of wrongness in the forest, a shadow that moves between the trees. What remains constant is the hunger. In every iteration, in every adaptation, the Wendigo is defined by need, by appetite that cannot be satisfied, by consumption as existential condition. The details vary, but the core remains. This is a thing that eats and eats and eats and is never full. Why does this resonate so powerfully in the modern imagination? Perhaps because we recognize it. Not as a creature in the woods, but as a shape inside our own skulls. An archetype of addiction and compulsion. The voice that says, more. The feeling that no amount is ever enough. The sense that we are, despite every privilege and convenience, still somehow starving. The psychologist Carl Jung wrote about the shadow, the repressed parts of the psyche that we refuse to acknowledge, but which nonetheless shape our behavior. The Wendigo is the shadow made flesh. It is everything we fear about ourselves, our capacity for cruelty, for selfishness, for placing our own needs above all else, for consuming others to sustain ourselves. It is the fear that we are, underneath the veneer of civilization, still predators, still capable of anything if we are hungry enough, desperate enough, alone enough. The modern reinterpretations of the Wendigo myth often focus on isolation, on characters who venture into the wilderness and return changed, who cross some invisible boundary and become something other than human. This is not accidental. We live in an age of unprecedented connectivity and profound isolation. We are surrounded by people, yet profoundly alone. We consume more media, more information, more stimulation than any previous generation, and report feeling emptier than ever. The Wendigo speaks to this emptiness, to the sense that we are filling ourselves with things that do not nourish, that we are consuming and somehow still starving. In some recent interpretations, the Wendigo has become a symbol of environmental collapse. It appears in eco-horror stories as a force of nature taking revenge on human excess. As the spirit of the forest awakened by our devastation of it, as the accumulated rage of every clear-cut forest and poisoned river and extinct species rising up to devour the devourers. This reading is not entirely inaccurate, but it misses something crucial. The Wendigo is not nature's revenge. It is our own nature turned against us. It is what happens when we forget that we are part of the ecosystem, not separate from it. When we treat the world as resource rather than relationship. When we consume without reciprocity. The indigenous understanding was never that nature was pure or benevolent. It was that nature was powerful and indifferent and would respond to imbalance with correction. The Wendigo was that correction, the consequence of taking too much, of breaking the covenant. We are, as a species, breaking that covenant on a global scale, and the consequences are manifesting, not as a literal monster, but as feedback loops, climate instability, ecosystem collapse. The slow unraveling of the systems that sustain complex life. The Wendigo is not coming. It is already here. It has been here all along, growing larger with each feeding, and we have been feeding it for 200 years. But here is the thing about the Wendigo that the modern retellings often forget. In the original stories, the Wendigo could be defeated. Not easily, not without cost. But it could be faced, could be recognized for what it was, could be destroyed by those brave enough to confront it. The method varied. Some stories said it had to be stabbed in the heart with iron. Others said the heart had to be cut out and melted over a fire. Still, others said the creature had to be dismembered and the pieces scattered so they could never come together again. But the first step was always the same. You had to recognize it, had to name it, had to acknowledge that the thing wearing a human face was no longer human, that it was hunger given form, and that compassion, while admirable, was not appropriate here. That mercy meant ending it, not feeding it. This is the lesson we have yet to learn. We keep trying to feed the hunger, keep thinking that if we just produce more, consume more, grow more, the emptiness will be filled. That the system that creates the problem will somehow solve it. But the Wendigo teaches otherwise. It says the hunger is the problem, the consumption is the disease, not the cure. And the only way out is to stop feeding it, to face it, to name it for what it is, and then somehow to find the courage to cut out its heart of ice. The fire has burned down to coals. Outside, the snow has stopped. The stars are visible now, hard and bright and cold in the absolute clarity of 40 below. The kind of cold that makes the air itself seem to crystallize. The kind of silence that presses against the eardrums. This is the world the Wendigo was born into. Not a horror story, but a true thing. A description of what happens when humans face conditions that strip away every layer of civilization and leave only the animal need beneath. But also more than that, a warning that the animal need unchecked becomes something worse than animal, because animals stop eating when they are full. Animals take what they need and no more. The Wendigo, and by extension, humans in the grip of Wendigo, is unique in its capacity for hunger without end. We have traveled from the frozen forests of the subarctic to the anthropological archives to the metaphorical landscapes of modernity. We have seen the Wendigo as spirit and as psychosis and as symbol, as literal monster and as mirror. And the question remains, what do we see when we look into that mirror? Do we see a creature separate from ourselves? A monster we can point to and say, there is the evil, there is the hunger, there is the thing that must be destroyed? Or do we see something more troubling? Something that looks back at us with our own eyes and asks, what would you do? When would you cross the line? How hungry would you have to be before the unthinkable became thinkable? The Wendigo stories do not offer easy answers. They do not divide the world neatly into good and evil, human and monster. They acknowledge that the line is thin, that circumstances matter, that anyone can be transformed by need, too great to be borne. But they also insist on the reality of the line. They say, yes, the transformation can happen, but it is still a transformation. It is still a loss of something essential. It is still a crossing from the human world into something else. And once crossed, it cannot be uncrossed. This is the tragedy at the heart of the Wendigo myth. Not that monsters exist, but that they are made. That they were people once. That they had names and families and lives before the hunger consumed them. The modern world has largely forgotten how to think about this kind of tragedy. We prefer our monsters to be born monstrous, to be evil by nature rather than by circumstance. It is simpler that way, cleaner. It allows us to destroy them without guilt. But the Wendigo will not grant us that simplicity. It insists that we recognize the human face behind the monster, that we acknowledge our own capacity for monstrosity, that we understand the only thing standing between us and that transformation is a thin web of circumstance and choice and social constraint. And in the modern world, those constraints are fraying. We are collectively hungrier than we have ever been. Not for food. Most of us will never know the bone-deep starvation of a subarctic winter. But for meaning, for connection, for something to fill the vast emptiness at the center of our abundant, prosperous, desperately lonely lives. And the things we consume in an attempt to fill that emptiness do not nourish us. They only make the hollow deeper. This is the Wendigo's final lesson, that there are hungers of the spirit as devastating as hungers of the flesh, that we can starve in the midst of plenty, that the greatest danger is not the absence of food, but the inability to be satisfied by it. The old stories say that even after the Wendigo is destroyed, after its heart is melted and its ashes scattered, you can still hear it sometimes, in the wind, a whisper, a calling, the sound of hunger that has outlived the body that felt it. Listen, do you hear it? Or is that sound only the wind moving through the pines, ancient and indifferent, carrying the same message it has always carried? That winter is coming, that the stores will not last, that choices will be made, as they have always been made, between survival and humanity, that the hunger is patient, that it will wait as long as it takes for us to understand. The Wendigo was never in the forest. It was always inside, and it is still there now, in the cold space between need and satisfaction, between appetite and enough, still growing, still whispering, still promising that just one more acquisition, one more consumption, one more feeding will finally be the one that satisfies. The fire has burned down to ash. The forest is silent, and in that silence, if you listen carefully, you can almost hear it breathing. Your name.